when the handshake disappeared from the frame. At the G7 in Alberta, where group photos once symbolized Western unity, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney chose to stand outside the frame. No confrontational speeches, no harsh rebuttals, just a deliberate silence, and that alone made the world pause. While President Trump unleashed a barrage of tariffs on Canadian goods, igniting a costly trade war, a quiet repolarization of the global order was beginning, with Canada and Europe silently stepping into leadership roles. G7 Alberta. When the Allies' mask fell off, there were no gunshots, no borders breached, but in Alberta, amidst the cold Rocky Mountains, a real war broke out. Not an armed conflict, but a fierce confrontation between interests, principles, and national pride. And it didn't happen behind the scenes. It unfolded in front of the global spotlight at the G7 summit, once considered a fortress of commitments to cooperation and global stability. The crisis began like a sudden storm, but in truth, it had been smoldering for years. Since President Donald Trump entered the White House with the message of America First, the global economic order has not been the same. Trade agreements once built through thousands of hours of negotiation were suddenly torn apart. Traditional allies like Canada, the EU, and Japan, who had stood by the U.S. through wars and crises, gradually realized their loyalty was now seen as a given, even a burden. Alberta, summer of 2025. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney opened the summit with an ambitious proposal, a new comprehensive trade and security agreement that could be signed within 30 days between the U.S. and Canada. It wasn't just an economic plan, it was an invitation to reconciliation. But before Carney could even finish his 70-minute bilateral meeting with Trump, the U.S. president suddenly held a separate press conference, announcing a new tariff package, 25% on Canadian goods, 10% on energy, and 50% on steel and aluminum, the three vital economic pillars of Canada. At that moment, the atmosphere at the G7 changed completely. Handshakes became awkward. Small talk dropped into silence. Leaders looked on as a crack widened across the Atlantic. And between two people once seen as the pillars of the North American continent. At steel plants in Hamilton, Ontario, a somber mood spread just hours after Trump's announcement. Thousands of workers returned home haunted by one question: will I still have a job tomorrow? In an economy deeply dependent on cross-border trade, the U.S.'s sudden erection of tariff barriers was a blow not just to GDP, but to trust. At gas stations in Alberta, where oil and gas are the region's lifeblood, companies began delaying orders, fearing that cash flow would no longer run smoothly. Media reports said energy order volume dropped 10% in just 3 days. In Washington, the Trump administration called its decision protecting American workers. But in Montreal or Vancouver, that translated into a different message. We don't need you anymore. In a world where supply chains are interwoven down to the smallest screw, building tariff walls not only slows trade, it turns trust into the scarcest commodity. Yet, in the eye of that storm, Prime Minister Carney chose a strange way to respond. No counterattack, no emergency press conference, no heavy accusations. He simply declined to sign the joint statement and refused to step into the traditional group photo with other leaders. A silence, by design. And it was that very silence that made the world take notice. In the G7 meeting room, where words are usually the tools of politics, Canada's silence suddenly became the most powerful language. It couldn't be edited on television. It couldn't be twisted by tweets. It was simply an absence, but one large enough to leave Donald Trump without a reaction platform, and deep enough to plant in the minds of European allies a question: is it time we need a new structure? No one declared a break, but everyone could see clearly. The G7 was no longer the cohesive bloc it once was. And perhaps that very moment when Carney stepped back from the frame, not because he was excluded, but because he chose to, will mark the beginning of a new trade order where Canada no longer walks behind the U.S., but begins to chart its own path. The strategy of silence, Canada's new diplomatic weapon. As international reporters waited silently for the joint statement to conclude the G7 summit in Alberta, something unusual happened. No joint declaration was signed. There was no joint press conference, no final handshake or friendly glance. Instead, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked out alone, quietly, holding a thin stack of papers, the symbolic chairman's statement, with no mention of the United States and no commitment to the White House. And then he turned away, without saying a word. In international politics, long dominated by bold slogans, tough statements, and public sparring, Carney's strategy felt like a velvet-gloved strike, soft, yet remarkably precise and dangerous. The strategy of silence he employed wasn't avoidance. It was a sophisticated counterattack, carefully calculated from experience and history. People still remember clearly the 2018 G7 summit, held in Charlevoix, Quebec. Just as everything seemed settled, with the leaders agreeing on a common statement and printed copies prepared for the media, President Donald Trump suddenly withdrew his signature with a tweet mid-flight back to the U.S., calling the Canadian Prime Minister at the time weak and dishonest. In an instant, Canada was cast into an embarrassing diplomatic spotlight. Mark Carney never forgot that lesson. At Alberta this year, he made sure not to fall into the same political trap again. No signatures, no vulnerability for withdrawal, and more importantly, no material for Trump to use as propaganda. In that context, silence became a form of soft resistance, powerful enough to stir global currents. Trump was clearly displeased. Images captured during side meetings showed an angry expression, uncomfortable whispers among American aides, and a departure from Alberta earlier than scheduled. In silence. What irritated Trump wasn't criticism, he's used to that, but the absence of a response. A script without an opponent is one he cannot control. And that very fact shook the foundation of his soft power at the G7. Meanwhile, Carney's approach was quietly applauded by European leaders. Sometimes the clearest form of protest is saying nothing at all, remarked an advisor to the French president in the hallway. Countries like Germany, France, and the Netherlands, also weary of America's unilateralism, saw in Carney a new archetype, a leader who doesn't need to shout to be heard. At its core, silence wasn't retreat. It was a way of forcing the world to read between the lines, to observe behavior instead of rhetoric. When Canada didn't sign, didn't appear in the photo, didn't speak alongside the U.S., it conveyed more than any press release ever could. It said, "We no longer accept a secondary role in a game where the U.S. writes the rules." Even the chairman's statement Carney released was a calculated message. In it, Canada reaffirmed its commitments to Ukraine, climate change, and multilateral democracy, but did not mention the U.S. or cross-border trade once. No mention, but everyone understood. It was deliberate disregard, a form of diplomatic embargo at the level of language. International media quickly called it a turning point in G7 diplomacy. Analysts at The Guardian and Le Monde argued that it wasn't merely a reaction to a tariff package, but the start of a new model of confrontation, where countries like Canada, France, and Germany would choose their own path, building a post-American order, or at least one independent of Washington's volatility. For the Canadian public, the image of their Prime Minister standing silent yet resolute before the world became a new symbol of resilience. A quick Ipsos poll showed 72% of Canadians supported this non-confrontational yet firm approach, viewing it as the sign of a mature nation that defends its interests without making a scene. Of course, silence can't last forever. Canada will eventually have to negotiate, to make decisions, whether moving closer to a new economic alliance with Europe or finding ways to de-escalate with the US. But for now, that silence has done something remarkable. It created an echo loud enough to force other superpowers to listen and rethink who's really leading the game. From summit to factory. When a diplomatic earthquake shakes the domestic ground. Mark Carney's silent strategy at the G7 in Alberta may have been a high move on the international chessboard, but for workers in Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, or Oshawa, they couldn't hear that silence. What they heard was the phone no longer ringing, the shift supervisor saying a few weeks off, the couples discussing how to cut expenses while waiting for an uncertain fall. The crisis, which began with a tariff announcement from Washington, has now seeped into every meal, every utility bill, and every sigh at the family dinner table. At a steel plant on the shores of Lake Ontario, output dropped by half in just 3 days. The glowing red-hot coils no longer rolled out continuously, but sat still on the conveyor belt, as if the line itself had stopped breathing. "We're not politicians," said a 47-year-old worker standing in front of the factory gate, holding a sign with the scrawled words, "We build this country, not break it. We just want to work." According to figures released by CBC, Canada's unemployment rate jumped to 7%, the highest since the COVID-19 pandemic. Notably, this increase did not come from the service or agriculture sectors, but from industries directly tied to exports to the U.S. In other words, the companies, factories, and workshops that have long been interlocked with the U.S. economy like inseparable gears are now jammed by newly erected tariff walls. The shock didn't stop at steel and aluminum. It spread to energy businesses in Alberta. Within a week, many liquefied gas orders to northern U.S. states were canceled, disrupting the operational chain. Oil and gas companies that had just begun recovering from a year of declining global fuel prices now face a risky policy freeze. "We're not worried about oil prices. We're worried about the price of trust," said one executive of an extraction firm. Trust. That is the resource depleting fastest in this entire crisis. Trust in the stability of U.S.-Canada relations. Trust in the fairness of the rules of trade. And for many citizens, trust that Ottawa can shield them from the political storms coming from Washington. The numbers don't lie. Social surveys show that nearly 60% of Canadians believe the relationship with the U.S. is no longer what it used to be, and nearly half support seeking alternative markets to reduce dependence on the United States. In a small commercial district in Mississauga, small business owners, long considered the backbone of the economy, are struggling with increasingly expensive import invoices. One mechanical shop owner lamented, "Each shipment from the U.S. now gets taxed more, but customers won't accept the new prices. We're being squeezed in the middle." Many small and medium enterprises are now considering importing from Europe or even Asia, despite the higher costs and more complicated transition process. But the impact isn't confined to Canadian borders. Right in the U.S., the retaliatory tariff shock is causing distress for many businesses. Car manufacturers reliant on Canadian components are facing the dilemma of rising costs, forcing them to cut production or raise prices, both leading to unwanted outcomes. Car prices in the U.S. are expected to rise by 3 to 6% in the next quarter. American consumers, once promised that America will be great again, are now paying the price in dealership bills, grocery receipts, and gas stations. Meanwhile, the border towns that once thrived on bilateral trade flows, like Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, are witnessing an unfamiliar reality. Trade bridges with few vehicles, Container yards running empty. Roads once bustling with honking horns, backhoes, and industrial sounds are now silent. No different than Carney's strategic response at the G7 summit. And that is perhaps the most frightening paradox. A silence at the governmental level may be a tactic, but when silence spreads to the domestic front, when workshops go quiet, coal yards see no laborers, factories lose the crackle of welders, then it's no longer strategy, it is crisis. Canadians are no longer just watching high-level meetings, they're watching every relief move from the government, every support package from the central bank, every tweet from the Prime Minister's office. Because when supply chains collapse, when jobs vanish, when the dream of stability falters, politics is no longer the business of parliaments. It becomes the business of every household. And the earthquake from Alberta shows no signs of stopping. An alliance in silence. When Europe and Canada joined hands without ceremony. As the trucks carrying broadcast equipment pulled out of Alberta, as leaders departed without leaving behind a commemorative photo, international observers began to notice something strange. This year's G7 summit didn't end with a commitment, but with a void? Yet within that void, a new alliance was forming, not through official oaths, not with flags flying, but through a shared understanding in response to a force once thought irreplaceable, the United States. Just 3 days after Prime Minister Mark Carney announced his decision not to sign the joint statement, the Office of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen unexpectedly unveiled an ambitious plan. 5 strategic pillars to strengthen Europe's economic autonomy, with a key focus on tightening cooperation with Canada. Diplomats understood immediately. This wasn't a coincidental reaction. This was a signal that Europe had grown tired of Washington's unilateral and unstable policies. A signal that when Canada chose to stand outside the G7 handshake, Brussels didn't see it as isolation, but as an invitation to a new alliance. The most noteworthy part of von der Leyen's plan wasn't flowery rhetoric, but concrete figures and actions. 50 billion euros funneled into Europe's semiconductor industry through the CHIPS Act, contracts for strategic mineral extraction with Congo and Gabon to reduce reliance on U.S. supply chains, $150 billion earmarked to support Ukraine, as a way to demonstrate that the Western order could exist without the White House at its center. And then, as if to seal this new strategy, the EU announced plans to build a green hydrogen corridor with Canada, a clean energy channel linking the two sides of the Atlantic. No bold slogans were needed. This alliance was being written through contracts, investments, and infrastructure. The very tools the U.S. once used to dominate the world, but now were gradually being transferred between its own allies. In Berlin, Paris, and Copenhagen, Carney's message was read not through signatures, but through political presence. European ministers consistently referred to the Canadian partner in press conferences, while French media described this year's G7 as the end of an American-centric era. Der Spiegel called Canada's stance courteous resilience, while El País of Spain asserted, steadfastness in silence is the greatest invitation extended to Europe. And it wasn't only Europe that was listening. In Asia, India began preliminary talks on a mineral corridor linking Canada to Europe, a new supply route designed to avoid dependence on China and the U.S. in the strategic minerals sector. Japan, a country directly affected by U.S. tariff policies, filed a complaint with the WTO and confirmed it would seek more reliable trade alliances, a phrase that, in the current context, everyone understood who it referred to. Interestingly, none of these countries spoke of breaking up with the U.S. No withdrawal announcements, no threats, but just like Carney did in Alberta, they were quietly stepping out of the collective frame, little by little. not to sow division, but to prepare for a new structure where the so-called international order no longer relies on an imposing superpower. If the Europe-Canada alliance fully materializes in the coming years, it could form a trade energy technology bloc independent of the U.S., accounting for up to 20% of global trade. But more than the numbers, the true value lies in the attitude. For the first time in decades, America's old allies are no longer trying to convince Washington to understand. They are writing the solution themselves. And it all began with a small act, refusing to pose for a photo. With a silence, with a step back that seemed soft, but was in fact making space for a new alliance to move forward. Carney didn't shout that he wanted to change the world order. He simply refused to continue playing a role in an outdated play. And the rest of the world? They are finding new footing on a stage that is both quiet and shaking. The price of sitting too high. When America became the outsider. For nearly a century, the U.S. didn't just sit at the center of the world's chessboard, it owned the board. From the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II, to Bretton Woods that laid the foundation for the global financial system, America was the place the world looked to whenever direction was needed. But the G7 in Alberta in 2025 marked a painful turning point. For the first time in history, the U.S. seat was still there, but its influence was gradually fading into a void. Trump left Alberta early. No agreements signed, no handshakes, no success story to take home and turn into a speech. Against the gray skies of the Rockies, the image of Air Force One taking off alone became an unwanted symbol. The U.S. wasn't excluded, but had stepped out of the game on its own. The consequences didn't stop at optics. As Canada and Europe began redrawing alliance networks, a series of other nations, once caught in the choice between belonging to the U.S. or the rest of the world, also began to pivot. Japan, Mexico, India, South Korea, mid-sized powers once wary of change, now appeared surprisingly eager to seek alternative cooperation tracks. Mexico, in a rare move, openly condemned the tariffs imposed at the border, calling them the weaponization of trade to force immigration policy. At the same time, they declared they would make no further concessions on border issues without corresponding economic conditions. This was the first time in over 15 years that a Mexican president didn't avoid but directly confronted the White House over trade, and received widespread support from domestic public opinion. In Asia, India remained quiet, but moved quickly. A preliminary agreement on a rare mineral supply chain with the EU and Canada could help New Delhi increase strategic mineral exports by 5% within just 2 years. But more importantly, India was signaling that it would not choose to become a trade satellite of any superpower, including the U.S., even South Korea. America's oldest traditional ally in East Asia began leaning in its own direction. Major tech conglomerates in Seoul were in talks with Brussels about establishing a semiconductor research hub in Europe, with Canada as a strategic logistics partner. A senior advisor at South Korea's Ministry of Economy bluntly stated, "We're not abandoning the U.S., but we can't rely on such erratic policy anymore." All these signals bounced back to Washington like cold waves, and inside America, the consequences began to take shape, step by step. The auto industry, one of the most vital pillars of the U.S. economy, was buckling under rising costs due to a shortage of parts from Canada and Europe. The production cost of each car assembled in Michigan had risen by an average of $4,800 just in the past quarter, forcing major manufacturers like Ford and GM to pause production of certain mainstream models. American consumers, once promised cheap cars, more jobs, now saw empty showrooms and ever thicker bills. In agriculture, farms in Iowa and Nebraska were losing international customers as countries turned to alternative suppliers from Europe or South America. A soybean farmer told CNN, "I don't know who the government is protecting, but it's clearly not us." Dissatisfaction was spreading not only among opposition voters, but also in states that had once been Trump's strongholds. Economists warned that if this situation continued, the U.S. could face a wave of import-driven inflation rising by another 2%, directly affecting everyday life at a time when interest rates were already at historic highs. Meaning, the so-called protectionist tariff policies were not protecting anything, but rather eroding purchasing power and market confidence from within. From Alberta to New York, from Brussels to New Delhi, a new reality is taking shape. Strength no longer lies in the loudest voice, but in the voice that keeps its word. And when America no longer keeps the promise of stability, no longer maintains the role of guide, even its closest friends must learn how to walk on their own. Trump once declared he wanted to make America great again. But this year's G7 revealed a bitter irony. By building walls and imposing tariffs, America didn't become great. It simply became alone. And in a world intricately connected, alone is no longer a sign of power, but the first symptom of irrelevance. From Trump's headshake to the world's nod. No official statement was needed to know that a new chapter had begun after the G7 in Alberta. One only had to look at the small but consistent moves. Canada quietly stepping out of the group photo, Europe accelerating transatlantic cooperation, and mid-sized powers beginning to rewrite trade roadmaps. Yet, amid these shifts, Mark Carney's role became clearer than ever. Not as a regional leader, but as a strategist shaping a world learning how to live without relying on the Washington axis. Because just as the U.S. roared with tariffs and withdrew with the image of Air Force One against Alberta's snowy mountains, Carney chose an entirely different language. Calm, structural response, and counteraction not through rhetoric, but through practical alliances. With Europe, he didn't need lengthy commitments. Only the willingness to lay the foundation for a green hydrogen corridor, open trade in clean technology, and propose a bilateral semiconductor research alliance. With India and East Asia, he didn't need drama, only the creation of a post-American strategic partnership system. Throughout the 2 weeks following the G7 summit, the Canadian Prime Minister's office became a discreet hub for negotiations. Diplomats called it the Nameless Summit, where delegations from Europe, India, Japan, and Mexico quietly came to Ottawa to hear one thing: where Canada was heading and how far they could go along. No tweets, no tabloid headlines. Yet those silent steps made Carney the new metronome for a trade structure slipping out of Washington's reach. This rise was far from coincidental. In a world post-pandemic, post-Ukraine conflict, post-Brexit, nations are craving a partner that is not only stable but also listens and builds for the long term. The U.S., with its increasingly erratic and disordered foreign policy, no longer inspires trust in sustainability. Meanwhile, Canada, through Carney's image, embodies exactly what the world seeks: courageous but not arrogant, principled but not dogmatic, firm but always leaving room for negotiation, and most importantly, acting out of vision, not out of anger. When pushed into a bind with tariffs on steel, aluminum, energy, and threats to supply chains, Ottawa didn't retaliate with counter-tariffs. It did something calmer, announced a $1.2 billion Canadian aid package for the domestic innovation industry, rerouted orders to Europe, and accelerated priority deals with the Indo-Pacific market. This was the response of a nation that knows it isn't a military superpower, but can be a strategic one. And the world understood that very quickly. Europe, under Ursula von der Leyen's leadership, began viewing Canada as a central link in the economic sovereignty strategy. gradually decoupling from U.S. supply chains to avoid future vulnerability. French policymakers even compared Canada to a Finland of the West, steadfast, non-confrontational, but a quiet wall blocking Washington's gusts of unpredictability. In Asia, some Indian experts called Canada the last safe bridge, as China grows more unpredictable and the U.S. more unreliable. Ottawa becomes the support beam for a conflict-free multilateral strategy. And in Japan, where businesses are now considering moving logistics hubs from California to British Columbia, people aren't speaking of affection, they're speaking of dependable capability. Carney didn't start a global revolt, but he did something even more important. He set a new reference point in international relations, where value lies not in pressure, but in the ability to coexist. Strategic silence is no longer a passive response, but a guiding language for a post-superpower era, where no one wants to be forced to pick sides, but everyone needs someone to walk beside. And in that moment, from Alberta, through Brussels, to New Delhi, the nod to Carney required no speech. It lay in quiet handshakes behind closed doors, in unrecorded phone calls, and above all, in the decision that if a new order must be built, then Canada might be the one holding the blueprint. The moment without a photo. When an empty frame became a global symbol, no one expected the most talked-about image after G7 Alberta to be a photo with no one in it. No row of seated leaders, no handshake in front of a national flag backdrop, no forced smiles or cold diplomatic stares, just a gap in the center where Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was supposed to stand. And in that absence, the world realized the strongest presence can come from a deliberate absence. That seemingly unremarkable photo, typically the final formality closing every summit. This year became the media's focal point, not because of who stood there, but because of who didn't. Carney not only refused to sign the joint statement, he refused to be framed in an image he knew was false, a photo that, in his words, would be used to portray a unity that no longer exists. For Western media, it was a wordless shock. For the first time in G7 history, the host nation was absent from the group photo. But for Carney, this was the only way to break a cycle that had grown obsolete, where everything was staged to make the world appear as though it was still moving in the same direction, while economic flows and trust had already begun diverging long ago. Strategically, it was a perfect strike. Carney did not attack, did not denounce, did not paint a tragedy. He simply left a space. And that space, strangely, said more than any statement, that Canada had chosen its own path, that the transatlantic relationship needed rebuilding, and that if the old world remained fixed in its structure, the principled nations would begin to step back by refusing to appear. Political analysts called it symbolic negation. Le Monde commented, "Carney has found a new diplomatic language, not through words, but through absence." The New York Times placed the photo on its front page with a stark caption, "Absent by design, present by impact." But even more important was how the public received it. In Canada, this act was not seen as irresponsible, as some early critics had feared. On the contrary, it sparked a powerful emotional wave among the public. Those who had long remained silent, long accepted the historical supporting role beside the U.S., suddenly felt a renewed sense of dignity. On social media, the empty photo quickly became a symbol. People tagged it with the hashtag #We stand where we choose, turning absence into a declaration of soft sovereignty. No shouting, no protest needed. Just one vacant spot at a summit was enough to spark the strongest political resonance in years. At universities and international think tanks, the story of the photo without a subject entered lectures as a textbook case of symbolic power in modern diplomacy. In Berlin, an exhibition of political photography dedicated an entire room to that single image, slowly rotating each angle, zooming in on the empty center, allowing viewers to feel the presence of the one who wasn't there. And from that absence, a question emerged. If Canada no longer stands there, who takes its place? The U.S. may still lead in military, finance, and Hollywood. But what about values? What about trust? What about moral standing in the eyes of global friends? Carney didn't answer. He simply stepped back, leaving space for that question to ring out. And the world, long accustomed to grand statements, was suddenly awakened by a void. Ironically, in an age where everything is staged to look real, one real act, simply not participating, became the most undeniable highlight. And when the leaders departed Alberta, carrying plans, documents, and press releases, the global public remembered only one thing: a photo with someone missing. A small, empty space, but one large enough to challenge the entire world order. When Mark Carney signed the order to retaliate against U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs with a 50% duty, he didn't just launch a trade war, he struck at the lifeblood of North America's supply chain. From factories in Detroit to canning lines in British Columbia, the shock began to ripple outward. This was no longer a question about the price of steel. It was a matter of survival, about power, carbon data, and the future of the continent's economy. The iron wall of tariffs. When metal becomes a political weapon, each ton of steel is no longer a unit of production, but a declaration of power. In the summer of 2025, Canada no longer played the silent elder brother in North American trade relations. They struck back. And that blow, a 50% tariff, shattered every outdated assumption that allies don't punish each other. In Ottawa's political arena, once accustomed to measured steps, this decision marked a historic pivot. It wasn't just a protest against an economic decree from Washington, but a shift in strategic thinking, from defense to active confrontation. The tariff Canada introduced wasn't impulsive. It was the result of months of endurance as Canadian metal plants struggled to compete, as production costs soared due to decisions made by a president across the border, and as faith in free trade agreements eroded day by day under the name Section 232. Since President Trump reignited steel and aluminum tariffs under the guise of national security, targeting imports from Canada, public opinion in both countries has been divided. But what happened on paper was just the surface. The reality in industrial zones, from Hamilton, Ontario, to auto plants in Windsor, painted a scene no report could fully capture. Slowed down assembly lines, delayed orders, reduced worker shifts, and raw material costs skyrocketing to levels small businesses couldn't survive. It was in that context that the retaliatory decision was signed, not with anger, but with the cold precision of someone who once governed the Bank of England, Mark Carney. For him, this wasn't an emotional war. It was a measured response, calculated down to each carbon unit, each furnace certificate, every data sheet tracing the origin of steel billets. Canada didn't aim to hurt the U.S. They aimed to make clear, if Washington's justification is security, then Ottawa has every right to defend its own industrial foundation. What's worth noting, this counterstrike didn't stand alone. It came with an entire support system for the domestic metal sector, from zero-interest loans to a CAD $4.8 billion fund invested in clean steel technologies. Carney wasn't just building a barrier, he was laying new foundations. An ecosystem Canada could actively sustain if the cross-border supply chain collapsed. This was strategic defensive preparation, but also a message: Canada can stand on its own. The impact of the 50% tariff wasn't just in pricing. It shook the entire trust in the stability of North America's free trade zone. For the first time since NAFTA, and later USMCA, businesses on both sides of the border had to ask, Could today's partner become tomorrow's knife holder? This was a psychological blow more dangerous than any percentage. When trust wavers, investment hesitates. And when major investors pull back, every stimulus package becomes nothing more than an umbrella in a political storm. Perhaps that's why international observers, from Tokyo to Brussels, paid special attention. They weren't just watching a clash between two allies. They were evaluating whether the Western alliance model could still be sustainable if every country is willing to strike for short-term gains. In this game, Canada chose to draw its sword first, not to win by force, but to make Washington confront a reality. No one stands outside the rules without paying a price. And so, the story is no longer about steel tariffs, but about the future of an economic order that the U.S. itself helped create. If they are the ones to break it, the next question becomes, who will take the lead? And will Canada still want to walk that path beside them? Data, carbon, and the counterstrike of the century. If the 50% tariff was the first punch, then what Ottawa prepared next was a sophisticated suit of armor, not made of steel, but of data, science, and climate ethics. This was no longer a battle over tariff figures, but a reshaping of the entire language of international trade. Who is cleaner? Who truly bears environmental responsibility? And who is merely disguising protectionism under the banner of national security? Mark Carney, with the mindset of a central banker and a public policy strategist, understood one thing clearly. You can't beat the U.S. by shouting louder, but you can win by proving that Canada is more transparent, more precise, and more ethical, down to every molecule of emission from a steel furnace. And so, within 48 hours of a closed-door cabinet meeting in late June, he instructed the entire national industrial technical system to provide a type of data never before brought to the negotiating table. Furnace locations, billet types used, power source for heating, and isotopic carbon traces. In an era where carbon is becoming political currency, Carney chose precisely what the U.S. didn't want to talk about: their climate footprint. The molten steel running through Pennsylvania furnaces might build tanks, but it emits twice as much as the same process in Quebec, powered by clean hydropower. When he declared, "If the U.S. invokes national security, we will invoke planetary survival," it wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a moral, preemptive strike. Canada's strategy became clear: multi-layered retaliation. Not just increased tariffs, but parallel deployment of green industry support packages. 4.8 billion Canadian dollars from the Green Steel Accord Fund, an alliance between the government and major private firms like ArcelorMittal, Rio Tinto, and Alouette. These public funds weren't scattered as damage control, but invested strategically, converting traditional furnaces to electric arc furnace (EAF) technology, piloting hydrogen-based direct reduced iron (HDRI), and developing inert anode, a smelting process for aluminum with no emissions. And here, Carney proved himself not only a macro-level coordinator, but a future architect. By prioritizing investment in clean aluminum technology in Quebec, he wasn't just saving the metals sector. He was preserving the entire ecosystem of supporting industries, from U.S. breweries relying on clean aluminum to qualify for Inflation Reduction Act (IRA) tax credits, to companies like Tesla needing low-carbon aluminum to back up their green commitments to shareholders and capital markets. Canada, long seen as a silent supplier of raw materials, now rises as the setter of standards. They're not cutting off supply, but asking, "Do you deserve it?" This is a reversal of soft power, a new form of clean tech diplomacy, where the country that controls clean production processes has the decisive voice in global supply chains. And in that race, Canada is one step ahead of the U.S. However, the game isn't just unfolding on the metallurgical floor, but also in WTO negotiation rooms. While Carney urged the Ministry of Justice to prepare a case against the U.S. at the Dispute Settlement Unit, DSU, he also unveiled a flexible tariff ladder. The 50% tariff would gradually decline each quarter if Washington reduced its Section 232 tariffs. This was a strategy of retaining leverage while signaling goodwill, firm enough to apply pressure, but soft enough to offer the opponent an honorable exit. That policy has been compared to the art of re-steering in international trade, not cornering the U.S., but forcing them to self-reflect, that a once trusted neighbor now has the capability and resolve to redefine the rules. Canada is no longer the follower accepting others' standards. They are writing the new ones, through carbon, through data, and through green investment. What's notable is that while the White House dismissed this as a technocratic financial game, conservative senators in Congress began warning, if Canada succeeds, Japan and South Korea will follow. And so, Carney's counterstrike isn't aimed at one decree. It targets the entire trade architecture of the Trump era. A strike that's not loud, but deep and enduring. When the supply chain becomes a crack in the map of allies. There are moments when a political decision that seems symbolic seeps deeply into every production line, every worker's payroll, every truck carrying parts across the border. The 50% tariff that Canada imposed on U.S. steel and aluminum was not just a line of trade law. It was a catalyst that made visible what the two North American economies had long avoided admitting. Their supply chain was no longer invisible or seamless, but fragile, fragmented, and politically risky. Less than 2 weeks after Carney signed the tariff order, tension signals began to surface, not at the top of diplomatic towers, but in industrial zones where contracts were delayed, orders returned, and cost spreadsheets started turning red. In Alberta, a pipeline project was suddenly halted due to steel pipe imports from the U.S. becoming over 30% more expensive. In Ontario, a major automotive chassis manufacturer, which had operated in sync with GM's plants in Detroit, had to cut back from 3 shifts to 2, and may soon be down to just 1. The impact didn't come from Canada targeting U.S. steel, but from the fact that both sides had staked their entire production model on the seamless interlinking of cross-border components. The Ambassador Bridge doesn't just carry goods, it carries the heartbeat of North America's heavy industry. And now, each shipment crossing from Windsor to Detroit carries not just bolts and axles, but anxiety. Will it still run next week? An internal Ford report showed that the increased cost of importing thick steel plates from Canada alone cut profit margins on each SUV made in Michigan by more than $320. Over a vehicle model's life cycle, that's about $45 million in lost profits, not to mention the ripple effects of reduced R&D budgets, delayed EV projects, and trimmed hours at supporting factories. But what worries Detroit's CEOs isn't just the number. It's the unpredictability. When the U.S. government imposes steel tariffs citing preventing Chinese steel masquerading as Canadian, and Canada responds by returning to American consumers a carbon math problem, the supply chain ceases to be an economic system and becomes a hostage in an ideological war. That's why concerns started spreading even to places seemingly on the sidelines. Craft breweries in Vermont, dependent on aluminum from Quebec for cans, began to see prices rise by the cent. A few small businesses even considered switching to glass bottles, despite higher shipping costs, just to escape a can war they never joined. Meanwhile, Tesla, planning to use clean Canadian aluminum at its Berlin plant, now faces the risk of reverting to Southeast Asian suppliers, bringing with it a host of carbon, tax credit, and brand image complications. From there, the North American supply chain, once praised as a model of efficient production integration, is becoming a discordant portrait. each country starts pulling back its own role, creating invisible cuts across the global production map. Worse, this happens at a time when automation, artificial intelligence, and green transition demand coordination, not division. Mark Carney, in a brief speech at the G7 summit, called this phenomenon a cold disintegration. Nations not withdrawing troops, not declaring war, but quietly backing away from integration commitments through tariffs and technical clauses. And according to him, if no correction is made, this disintegration will not only break the flow of goods, but also shatter faith in the sustainability of modern trade. It's no surprise that major banks like Morgan Stanley and RBC have begun adjusting their supply chain risk models. Because if a steel supply contract can be blown away by a single tweet or executive order, then trade stability has become the most fragile concept in an era of polarized geopolitics. And so, the supply chain, once a symbol of North American cooperation, is now a battlefield where every inch of steel, every carbon dollar, and every executive decision can disrupt a machine once thought untouchable. This is no longer a matter of production, but a test of trust. When prices become political statements. At a time when politicians declare they are protecting domestic production with tariff barriers, it is the consumers who end up paying the price, down to the last cent. The steel-aluminum tariff war between the United States and Canada has gone beyond the boundaries of a typical trade dispute, turning each can of beer, each pickup truck, each aluminum extrusion into living proof of a symbolic confrontation stretching from the London Metal Exchange to small suburban supermarkets. Within just 1 week of Canada announcing its 50% retaliatory tariff, the global metals market began to react in a domino effect. Cold-rolled steel futures on the London Metal Exchange, LME, surged by $60 per ton. 3-month aluminum futures exceeded $2,540 per ton, the highest in 8 months. Analysts at Morgan Stanley described it as a sudden return of supply security concerns, not due to immediate shortages, but because companies began doubting the reliability of global logistics networks. The paradox is this: Canada, a country with relatively small global output, holds in its hands an invisible but powerful weapon: low carbon intensity in metal production. That alone has forced many major U.S. corporations, heavily reliant on maintaining strong ESG ratings, to access cheap credit and sustainable investors, to nervously re-examine their balance sheets. If aluminum from Quebec is cut off, they don't just lose a supplier, they lose a key link to their green business image, which helped anchor them in the new investment wave. Tesla is a clear example. Its production lines in Nevada and Berlin had planned to use aluminum from Canada to meet EU carbon standards. Now, if forced to switch to imports from Indonesia or the Gulf, where most aluminum is coal-based, they could lose access to green financing, meaning financial costs would skyrocket, directly affecting profits and stock valuation. In a world where each percentage of emissions can be translated into money, Carney struck exactly at the pressure point that tariff walls cannot protect: reputation. It didn't stop there. The price war crept into even the smallest corners of the economy. The Beer Canada Association warned every cent increase in aluminum prices could push craft brewers off store shelves, where every centimeter is a battle for survival. With profit margins already razor-thin, a 5-cent increase per can due to packaging could mean the difference between surviving and going bankrupt. At supermarkets in Toronto or Montreal, consumers are beginning to see local brands slowly disappear, replaced by foreign products made with cheaper but lower-quality aluminum, with a more visible carbon footprint. In that context, Canadian policymakers had to urgently propose measures to buffer the price shock. Backroom negotiations with large corporations like Coca-Cola, Molson, and Danone were revealed. The government would consider partial tax exemptions if companies maintained import volumes according to historical quotas, a face-saving mechanism to avoid widespread inflation while keeping leverage over Washington. This is modern politics, negotiating the price of each beverage can to maintain strategic pressure. Still, one cannot deny, citizens of both countries are the direct victims. In Michigan, where large pickup trucks are produced, the average cost per vehicle has increased by nearly 850 Canadian dollars, as components imported from Ontario were hit with reciprocal tariffs. In Vancouver, real estate developers have had to recalculate entire building designs due to shaped steel prices rising over 15%, affecting project timelines. It's the inevitable cost of a war where no matter who wins, the people still pay with their cost of living. Carney knows this well, but instead of dodging the issue, he chose to price politics transparently. The tariff announcement came with a graph showing the schedule, high at first, gradually reduced quarterly if the U.S. de-escalated. Not just as a market signal, but as a message to both Wall Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. Canada doesn't want to escalate, but is ready to pay the price to defend fairness. And if necessary, they will turn every price increase into a challenge against the logic of their opponent's policy. When prices become vehicles of political messaging, every card swipe, every raw material order, every distribution contract becomes an unofficial referendum. In this chess match, Canada isn't playing with weapons, but with invoices. And in an era where economics are tightly intertwined with social perception, that may be the most dangerous strike of all: the tariff ladder and the two-way game. In political economic confrontations, victory isn't about the applause at the beginning, but about who still has a seat when the dust settles. Mark Carney understands that, and instead of pushing Washington into a corner, he chose to build an exit. But not just an exit for the U.S., an exit for both sides. A path designed with data, trust, and political transparency. They call it the tariff ladder. Amid rising tensions, as inflation indicators began casting shadows over consumer confidence, Ottawa didn't fire another shot, but released a slim 3-page document that hit like a disarmament map. In it, the 50% tariff was not permanent, but the starting point of a conditional downward sequence. Each quarter, if Washington gradually reduced metal tariffs under Section 232, then Canada would reduce accordingly. A policy that seems simple, but in reality is a powerful psychological weapon. Because at that moment, Carney wasn't just negotiating with the White House, he was negotiating with CEOs, lobbying groups, and citizens paying more each day. He knew no politician dares to retreat if only pressured. But if they're given a way to back out with dignity while keeping the national interest defender mask intact, the game might end in a draw. That's not weakness. It's a strategy of soft overcoming hard, using long-term structure to defuse short-term conflict. The tariff ladder also helped Ottawa restore the image of a responsible country in the global trade system, something especially important in a time when the WTO is paralyzed by an appellate mechanism crisis. When Canada clearly announced its conditions for reducing tariffs, it indirectly sent a message to other partners. We're not acting on a whim, we have reasons, and those reasons can be defended before any international legal body. At the same time, Canada's Ministry of Justice quietly finalized a case to file with the WTO's Dispute Settlement Unit, DSU. In it, Ottawa accused the U.S. of abusing Section 232, a mechanism originally designed to handle military threats, not protect domestic industry. Though Carney was fully aware, with Washington still blocking WTO judge appointments, the chance of the case being processed in the next few years is close to zero. But what he wanted wasn't a courtroom win. It was a public opinion win, because once the file is submitted, Canada can cite international procedure to legitimize its actions. No longer just an emotional retaliation, but a response with grounds, oversight mechanisms, and accountability. While the U.S. side continues to emphasize national security as an absolute umbrella, Carney chose transparency as his rain shield. And this strategy wasn't only supported by Canadian citizens. According to the latest Abacus data poll, 61% of nationwide voters and 68% in Ontario's industrial belt agreed with the conditional retaliation stance. Notably, even conservative voter groups, who typically oppose government intervention, said Canada should respond proportionally but within limits. That shows the tariff ladder isn't just a diplomatic tool, but also a social stabilizer in times of upheaval. Inside Parliament, Carney also succeeded in building a temporary bipartisan coalition, though Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre criticized him for retaliating with the same behavior we condemn. MPs from the Bloc Québécois and the NDP stood behind him, for one simple reason. If no action was taken, Canada's metallurgy sector would be swept away by costs, and workers would be the first to lose. The carrot-and-stick strategy, high tariffs but conditionally declining, is also being closely observed by other countries. In Tokyo, Seoul, Brussels, trade analysts are starting to view Canada as a model to counter the U.S.'s unilateral policies. No direct confrontation, no total withdrawal, but a three-lane road, with a counterattack path, a de-escalation lane, and enough room for allies to join if needed. In a crisis, some politicians choose to strike hard to score points. Others choose to endure to maintain stability. But there is a rarer kind, one who dares to design a system where even the opponent sees a way out. Mark Carney is doing just that. Not just for Canada, but potentially for the entire post-globalization trade system. And if his tariff ladder succeeds, it may become the default model for how the future world handles shocks no one wants, but everyone must face. From Ottawa's Parliament to the silent room in Washington. The steel and aluminum war between Canada and the United States, though gunless, is opening two opposing fronts within each country's political sphere. In Ottawa, it is a boisterous forum where parties debate fiercely over the limits of protectionism and national responsibility. In Washington, it's a much quieter room, where no one dares admit that the policy designed to protect American steelworkers may actually be costing them their jobs. Up north, Mark Carney makes no secret that the decision to impose a 50% tariff was a calculated strike to force the White House to face reality. Their economy is no longer as independent as the America First slogan proclaims. But he also knows that for the counterstrike not to become a double-edged sword, he must build a strong enough political foundation. And that's why he played a rare move in Canadian political history. A temporary alliance among ideologically opposed parties. With support from the New Democratic Party, NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, two forces deeply skeptical of the American-style free market model. Carney built a political buffer zone in favor of tough but reasoned action. They weren't just opposing Trump. They were opposing the notion that Canada must always play the quietly enduring partner. And more importantly, they believed it was time for Canada to stop playing the role of compliant trade partner and become a strategic rival of equal weight. But not everyone supports it. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre accused the Prime Minister of sabotaging the beaver economy, an image evoking the hardworking, gentle, and patient spirit of Canadians. In his view, retaliating against the U.S. with tariffs is counterproductive, pushing the domestic economy into an unnecessary confrontation spiral. Yet, polling numbers contradict that view. 61% of national voters and nearly 70% in industrial Ontario affirm their support for the conditional retaliation policy. They aren't choosing anger. They're choosing strategic self-defense. Meanwhile, in Washington, things are more complicated. Outwardly, President Trump remains firm with his old rhetoric. Steel is the backbone of national security. But internally, reports are piling up. 4,200 jobs at risk in Ohio, 3,600 in Pennsylvania if the supply from Canada is disrupted. More concerning, these are two key swing states in the upcoming election, where he previously won thanks to pledges to protect heavy industry. Moreover, industry giants, from Ford to General Motors, have begun to speak up in internal reports. Steel tariffs are eating into profit margins and forcing them to cut back on electric vehicle projects. The protectionist argument is becoming harder to defend, especially as the reality shows. Most of the taxed raw materials aren't from China, but from Canada itself, the closest and oldest ally. Ironically, the steel unions, once staunch Trump backers, are now caught in a dilemma. They're protected by the tariff wall, but watching factories lose orders due to part shortages from Canada. Keeping the tariffs, but losing jobs. That's the paradox no one wants to say out loud, yet everyone is facing. And inside the White House, whispers begin about the political cost of a policy too easy to expand, but too difficult to roll back. Carney didn't wait for the opponent to break the deadlock. He chose to shape international opinion through sideline meetings at the G7, G20, and APEC. In London, he leaked a policy summary of the reverse tariff ladder to the press. In Tokyo, he met privately with Japan's Minister of Industry to explain why, if Canada succeeded, Japan could adopt a similar model. And in Brussels, European negotiators began asking, is this the moment to establish a collective mechanism to counter the abuse of Section 232? The more countries start asking questions, the more pressure mounts on Washington. Not because they're being isolated, but because they're standing on the wrong side of allies who've stood beside them for 70 years. And in a global order, fracturing under populism, Carney seems to be crafting a new version of soft power. No preaching, just showing the world that the rules can be rewritten. By refusing to stay silent. If Ottawa succeeds, they will not only prove the strength of a middle power that knows how to use data, policy, and alliances at the right time. They will also send a clear signal. In this era of chaos, it's not the loudest voice that wins. It's the one that can make the opponent's silence unbearable. When the outsider becomes the beneficiary. In any conflict, there's a loser, a winner, and someone standing outside harvesting the gains. In the steel-aluminum war between the United States and Canada, the name barely mentioned in early headlines, but prominently present in geopolitical backrooms, is China. International observers have grown accustomed to the West shooting itself in the foot. But this time, the degree of internal division and blindness meant Beijing didn't need to do much. Just wait. Wait for one side to erect tariff walls, the other to retaliate, and both to disrupt supply chains they spent decades building. Meanwhile, Chinese steel trains quietly roll along the Asia-Europe economic belt, through Kazakhstan and into Europe. China's Ministry of Commerce, typically reserved in official statements, suddenly released Q2 data showing steel exports to the Eurasian Economic Union, EEU, rose by 22.6%, a modest figure that hints at much more. Hot-rolled steel volumes shipped via Kazakhstan, then rerouted to Eastern Europe surged, while nations long faithful to North American suppliers began considering shifting supply chains to reduce political risk. China doesn't need to directly intervene in the Canada-US clash. They only need to tune their production rhythm to the instability cycle of the West. When the U.S. clamps down on Canadian steel, Texas mills look elsewhere. When Canada fights back, aluminum prices climb, forcing buyers to seek cheaper sources regardless of carbon or ethics. And that source, often labeled the steel inflation nation, is still China, with metallurgical capacity the world has never controlled. Mark Carney knew this well. In a cabinet meeting, he bluntly said, "We are punishing each other to create space for a rival that doesn't need permission to seize market share." It's no coincidence that in the retaliation roadmap, he tied trade policy to carbon standards. Because once Canada forces the world to account for emissions footprints, China, relying heavily on coal for its furnaces, will enter the game with much weaker numbers. However, moral weapons aren't enough without allies. That's why Ottawa is proactively sharing low-carbon supply chain data with Japan, South Korea, and European countries, where bilateral trade deals are being renegotiated with stricter climate terms. In this approach, Canada is not just a retaliator. They are a standards pioneer, a rules maker for the post-globalization era. And if those rules gain acceptance, nations will have tools to jointly challenge the USA's Section 232, criticized for its ambiguity, unilateralism, and susceptibility to abuse. A legal environmental front could form, including Canada, Japan, Germany, France, and even Australia, discussing how to prevent a country from wielding national security as a universal wildcard to sidestep common trade rules. Meanwhile, China is accelerating quietly. No longer explicitly named in this conflict, they've become the default alternative supplier. They approach African and Latin American countries with low prices and streamlined contracts. With each steel shipment, they reinforce their position as the world's ultimate factory, despite Western efforts to reshuffle supply chains. The result? Once again, conflicts among Western allies become launchpads for the very rival they meant to restrain. And as the U.S. pushes Canada away, Canada, in its weakened state, is forced to pursue alternative markets, deepen trade ties with Asia and Europe, and expand green agreements as soft power tools. And China? They just keep producing. While the world debates origins, they're capturing the destination. Carney, during a brief press conference, sighed when a German reporter asked, "Do you think China is winning?" He replied simply, "We aren't letting them win, but we have paved the road ourselves." And that may be the truest description of the metal conflict of 2025, a fight between two allies, yet echoing into places they never expected.